Now, one of the ways I think you could come into the topic that is a little bit different, might not be what people are expecting to hear, is you could say the resolution is a true statement because claims of individual rights are the exception. What a government does day by day, the overwhelming majority of its work, the essence of its work, is taking care of everybody that comes under its jurisdiction and finding out and putting into effect the wishes of everybody that comes under its jurisdiction. Whereas a person stepping out and saying, I have a right that must be observed, that may not be violated, is something that happens once in a while. Now, it depends, of course, on which branch of government you're talking about. If you're talking about the operation of the judicial system, then every moment there are people making rights claims back and forth. But even there are a lot of proceedings that are about equity, that are about reading of the will, and so forth. There are lots where it's less about what everybody's rights are, and it's more about how can we take care of everybody? How can we maximize everybody's wishes in this case? And you might even answer the argument, if the negative tries to come back and say, well, what about the judicial system? Then you can say the judicial system is the problem solver of last resort. It's what we go to when the other branches of government haven't done their job. And since the topic refers to the government as a whole, the legitimacy of the entire government, if it is true that more of whether a government is working properly has to do with taking care of everybody than has to do with fulfilling the claims of individual people to have their rights protected. If it's more important to take care of everybody, if more effort goes into that, if more of the daily enterprise of governing goes into that, then the resolution is true. That's an approach to affirming the resolution. You might also, this is an argument that I think has some potential to, and you might even just throw it in as kind of an observation. It might be tagged on to some of these other affirmative approaches, to say that in striking the balance between what the majority wishes and what individuals wish, don't let the negative try to say that all people who make an individual rights claim do so because they are powerless and in need of protection. Don't let them get away with that at all. Very often, when individuals make claims on the government, it is because they are extremely powerful. Rupert Murdoch, who is a billionaire several times over, has several times gone to court to try to acquit his rights, not because he's oppressed, not because the government is trampling him underfoot, but because he wants to control all or nearly all of the mass media outlets in the United States, and he uses his rights as codified in law as a way to do that, as a way to become very, very, very powerful. And in the history of the United States, you can go back to the Gilded Age, you can go back to the robber barons, and you can find all kinds of examples where the will of the people was used as a check on that kind of small groups or even individuals gathering a lot of power to themselves. And I think if you do that, if you make that argument, you could diffuse one of the more appealing arguments that the negative has, which is that we need to protect individuals from the will of the mob. That actually may be a good transition for me to talk about the negative's position on this. And, well, okay, I guess it is actually. I think that probably the best position you've got on the negative is to say that it is a primary duty of government to protect individuals against the massive group power. I think you can say that consent of the governed, taking the popular will, that's a check. That's the way that you prove government hasn't gone wrong. That the Declaration of Independence says when the government no longer responds to the popular will, then it's time for the government to fall. But that doesn't mean that the negative statement doesn't translate necessarily into a positive statement. There are a lot of people who would say government is functioning properly when the people are pretty much unaware of it, when the people simply have no objection to it. But anytime people try to marshal their efforts together and impose their will on particular members of the group who might be dissenters, that's when the government's got to step in. And I think what you could say, I think there are a number of different kinds of individual rights that you can make very appealing in the context of this argument. I think this is where you bring in free speech and free expression, and you make the very easy to win argument that popular ideas do not need protection, that we have a First Amendment and we have freedom of speech because unpopular ideas have to be protected. And then I think you take that trope, that approach to that argument, that commonplace, and you can apply it in a lot of different situations. I think, and I know you want to shy away from necessarily a lot of biblical references, but I think you could include freedom to worship. what if everybody in your neighborhood is of a different denomination and they vote and they decide that you are now of their denomination? Well, that isn't how it works in this country. That's your individual right. And it doesn't matter how many people want to say no, then, that's still something that's left within the individual's realm of decision making. Now, you're going to have to deal with counterexamples having to do with things like faith healing, Christian Science, and so forth, and there have been a number of those in the news lately. What if your decision to worship means that you keep your young children out of medical care when they've got life-threatening illnesses? Does the government, does the community have to let you do that, or can they override that? And you're going to have to do a little research into those issues and figure out how to finesse those topics. I think what you'll find is that the government says that attorneys admit, judges write into their opinions, that they still take that decision very seriously. They defer to the individual's judgment right up to the point where another individual is having their rights threatened by, the fact that they have a right to life and they're about to be deprived of that. And it is never the case that it's simply the popular will that the religion is unpopular, therefore it can be expelled from the community. So I think you can thin that argument off pretty easily. I think you could also include, and this might work really well for the judging pool, that you have the ability of parents to make decisions about their kids, even the decision to homeschool, that even if those are unpopular decisions, that it's a primary duty of the government to keep the mob, to keep the collective will from impinging on the rights of individuals. I think that by the end of the debate, by when these arguments play out, that is going to have enough appeal to it that unless you really just don't know what you're doing and you really haven't gamed out everything the affirmative could say, I think the negative's going to win a lot on that. A couple of other approaches. I think you could say that the topic could have been true if it was written differently. I think that you could say, and I even referred to consent of the governed a few minutes ago, but if the topic had said consent of the governed, then that would have been reasonable because it would leave room for the idea that everybody can sacrifice, that everybody can give up what they want, that if the government comes and asks us all to make a shared sacrifice, that we can agree to make a sacrifice. But when they write the term sovereignty into the topic as that which the affirmative has to uphold, that sovereignty is a pretty expansive concept. Sovereignty cannot admit to any restrictions upon itself. It is unfettered openness of action. So I think you could say that a lot of the affirmative's arguments may assume that the government has a duty to respect the will of the people, but will is a much smaller concept than sovereignty, and giving it a popular sovereignty is pretty dangerous. And that actually is a good transition point into the last idea I have, which is, if I were you and I were putting together my negative case, I would say, in all matters of politics and good government, the most powerful evidence is the evidence of history. And the weakest evidence is the evidence of philosophizing, inductive, speculative, abstract reasoning, well, probably not inductive, more likely deductive. If we try to act as philosophers and reason our way to good government, we are on much shakier ground than if we look at the evidence in history. And the first reason that I just facepalmed when I saw the wording of this topic was you can go back to Stephen Douglas's campaigns for the Senate, for the presidency, and so forth, and he used the term popular sovereignty a lot. And what did he use it in favor of? He used it in defense of slavery. He used it in defense of the idea that each state ought to decide whether slaves could be brought into the state. Each state ought to vote, which leaves the affirmative defending slavery. And that is, in some ways, kind of almost the cliche example of a worn-out argument, but I mean, my goodness, go back and look at his campaign speeches, and you could even include some of them in your negative constructive, in your modules to start off the debate, because he uses the phrase popular sovereignty. It is about as on point as evidence could ever get, and it is extremely powerful because it is the lesson of history. You couple that with your argument that consent of the governed, sure, consent of the governed is a useful check, a useful feedback that keeps the government from becoming tyrannical. But popular sovereignty goes too far. And it says that even in areas where individual rights ought to be respected, that the collective will of the people can crush that shell of protection, and that is the idea that's indefensible. So those are a few ideas to get you started, and as more things occur to me, maybe I'll tag on a few additional ideas in the weeks down the road. Good luck with your brainstorming and your research.